Welcome to our forum on the Internet and democracy. We are here to consider the meeting of two of the most powerful and remarkable trends of our social and political times. On the one hand, the resilient and impressive resurgence of demands for greater democracy in all sorts of places in the world, certainly the Middle East, North Africa, in China, and lately even in the United States. Social phenomena, heartwarming and impressive to me for the resilience of democratic ideas even in the face of so many frustrations. And the other trend, running parallel or in collision course, depending on your view of things, the rise of an information-rich world, a world in which everybody has access to all kinds of new sources and modes of information, including political actors whose calculations and whose strategies inevitably are shaped by this new information environment. We will be hearing, as you know, from Jillian York of the Electronic Frontier Foundation and Evgeny Morozov from Stanford, and our moderator is Deirdre Mulligan. More about them in just one moment. I'm James Rule. My home here on campus is the Center for the Study of Law and Society at Bolt, or as we're supposed to say, Berkeley Law. So don't send the authorities after me. Berkeley Law, that's where we are. Not Bolt, that's old stuff. There are three organizations. I'm, for these purposes, not representing the Law and Society Center, but Dissent magazine, with which I've been affiliated for a long time, and I'll have more to say about that too in a moment. There are three organizations that have put this occasion together. Two of them campus organizations. One of them, the Institute for the Study of Social Issues, it's located on Bowditch Street. Interdisciplinary center that's dedicated to the study of critical, salient social issues, immigration, globalization, development of new technologies, and repercussions on labor and politics. And the CITRIS Data and Democracy Initiative, whose center of gravity is at Siddhartha Dai Hall, which looks particularly at information technologies and information processes and their inputs on critical social issues, precisely what we're preoccupied with this afternoon. As for Dissent, it is my role and my pleasure to introduce it. I hope you've already acquired your own copy of Dissent and the literature that goes along with it. Dissent is a small, independent political quarterly. It represents the democratic left. It was founded in 1954 at the height of the McCarthy era, and it's throughout its lifetime as a publication, up through this recent decade when it's also developed an internet presence, as well as being a hard copy political quarterly. Dissent has been focused utterly on democracy, on the extension of democratic institutions as much as possible around the world, and to the deepening and authentication of democratic institutions where they could stand to go deeper. So the subject of the talk today is of profound concern to the magazine, and we hope that you'll see that connection as we go on. Just to say one thing by way of introduction of Dissent. Dissent, people associated with Dissent are proud of the fact that it continued to monitor democratic stirrings in Eastern Europe during those bad old days of the Soviet bloc, when many intellectuals in the West had counted out the possibility of democratic change. We now find ourselves, all of us, in a historical moment where we believe that the changes that could arise from the Arab Spring and the other democratic movements around the world could have as profound world historical repercussions as the events that began to chip away at what everybody thought was a monolithic and unchangeable Soviet bloc. So we look with excitement and anticipation and some anxiety at the fate of democratic movements around the world. And of course, no less important, the role that information processes play in abetting or even subverting these movements, a matter of obvious concern this afternoon. If Dissent has any ulterior motive, and of course we all have ulterior motives in helping to put this event together, it's that we want to escape from the eastern seaboard intellectuals ghetto and become more known on the left coast of this country, which seems to us the source of all kinds of effervescence and sophisticated thinking that the magazine would like to absorb. We want to make contact with new readers and potentially new writers and supporters of all kinds. And above all, participants and followers of the magazine from this information culture that flourishes more strongly here in the Bay Area, I would say, than any other region. So we hope that you'll take this chance to take a look at Dissent, to leave us your contact information so that we can tell you more in due course about the magazine, and that you'll stay in touch with us over the course of future events and through the magazine itself. But the main order of business, of course, is our two main speakers, and I'm going to give the absolute minimalist introduction to them and to Deirdre Mulligan, our moderator, simply because I hate it myself as a consumer of introductions that are stand in the way of the substance of things. Jill York from the Electronic Freedom Foundation in San Francisco is the director of that institution's International Freedom of Expression program. She was formerly part of Harvard's Beekman Center for the Study of Internet and Society. She has long experience in participation in tracking grassroots movements in North Africa and the Middle East. And this is the most remarkable item, as far as I'm concerned, on our curricula vitae. She writes regularly for Al Jazeera. How many of us can say that? Evgeny Morozov originates from Belarus. He was educated, among other places, at the American University in Bulgaria. He made an enormous impression, including on me, with his book, The Net Delusion, which was published last winter. An extremely skeptical but enormously well-informed and analytical look at the role of information processes in curtailing as well as abetting grassroots movements. An enormously well-informed and well-documented book. It's rare for me to find a book that has both an argument and the depth of evidence to back up those arguments. And it's ever since then, Evgeny has been embroiled in comment and controversy, some of which he has helped, to be fair, to foment in his own right. So we have the most profound issues to discuss, and of course there's no forum without content. The content will be provided by Deirdre Mulligan. She is assistant professor at the iSchool here on campus, graduate of Georgetown University Law School, former staff counsel to the Center for Democracy and Technology in Washington, where I first met her quite some time ago, and someone with a very long record of involvement in trying to make the best democratic possibilities of technological change. So with that, I turn matters over to Deirdre, and I can't wait for what comes next.
Okay, and we're going to move really quickly to the meat of the program, and I'm going to invite Evgeny Morozov, whose name I promised to bundle several times during the program, to lead us off. And he is going to talk for about 15 minutes. We're then going to let Jillian have her 15 minutes, and then we're going to engage them with each other, and I'm going to ask a few questions, and then I'm going to open it up to you. Please.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. You didn't bundle my name, so...
Yeah.
All right, so I have 15 minutes. I don't think I can provide a full-blown, ambitious theory of what the internet does to democracy in a quarter of an hour, but I'll give you some hints at what my perspective is and try to articulate what the implications of that vision for the policy of the United States government is. So to start, I think it's impossible to understand my own view on this without considering the background. The background is that I come from Belarus. That's where I was born and raised, and that's where I started thinking about the implications of the internet. Straight out of college, I joined an NGO that was based in Prague, in the Czech Republic, that sought to use new media and the internet to try to push against some of the governments. Some of them are more authoritarian than others in the former Soviet region. So my job there was director of new media, and more or less I traveled to places like Central Asia and the Caucasus, and worked with activists and bloggers and journalists and tried to understand their needs in terms of social media and tried to train them about raising awareness online and trying to use blogs and social networks to promote their causes. So I did it for 3 years, which armed me with, I think, a pretty good perspective of both how bloggers and activists on the ground think, but also of how their supporters in the West think. And what I discovered in these 3 years I've been doing that work is that, first of all, the bloggers and activists were increasingly outruled and outsmarted by their governments. The governments were getting increasingly active online, and I identified 3 main activities of their work in cyberspace, and that was propaganda, that was surveillance, and that was censorship, and particularly new means and forms of censorship like cyber attacks. So I started thinking about how the internet can actually be useful to authoritarian governments, and I spent 3 years researching that and trying to understand ways in which the Russian government, the Chinese government, the Iranian government, and others have actually profited from it. And I discovered that there are plenty of ways in which they use it to monitor what activists are doing, what they're planning, to spread their own gospel online by hiring bloggers and training them and actually dispatching them to comment on online threads and forums that may post some information critical of the government. That was a pretty vibrant sphere of activity, with governments getting more and more active, and particularly using more sophisticated methods. As I said, cyber attacks, for example, became a new way of censorship, particularly around particular political events. So we would see that elections would happen in a country like Belarus, and the government normally wouldn't actually censor any websites, but instead of blocking access to them, they would, through proxies and other actors that we don't know about, they would actually launch cyber attacks, making the websites of the opposition unavailable on the day of the election, thus making it impossible for people to spread news about how to organize and where to organize, right? So it was a very tactical intervention that was also very hard to link to the government, because unlike in traditional internet filtering schemes where technically the government would issue some kind of decree or order banning a certain website, there was no paper trail of any sort leading cyber attacks to the government. So from a government's perspective, they were actually perfect, because these attacks would not figure on any of the reports about freedom of the media published by Western NGOs and whatnot, right? So having noticed that, I began thinking why it is that we haven't paid enough attention to the ways in which the internet could also be a source of repression and a source of surveillance and propaganda and censorship. And as I was doing this work, I also saw that our excitement about what social networks and blogs could deliver actually doubled and tripled. And it doubled and tripled for various reasons. I think the fact that Obama got elected in part by using new media to fundraise really made a lot of people, particularly in Washington, become extremely optimistic about what the internet could deliver. There appeared entirely new job positions in the US government, with people dealing with the internet and new media, trying to think about how to apply them to foreign policy. And I would argue that some of that excitement has not been particularly helpful to the US foreign policy agenda in general and to the internet in particular. But the way I would argue some other reasons why we got excited, if you remember the Twitter revolution in Iran, when we saw a lot of coverage in the Western media of young Iranians using cell phones and the internet and whatnot to organize and mobilize, in particular Twitter and Facebook. If you looked at the actual data coming out of Iran, you would see that most of that was not Iranians, but rather Americans or Iranians abroad, talking about what was happening back in Iran, which again plays an important function, but it's not the organizational and sort of mobilizational functions that we attributed to Twitter and Facebook initially. And I began thinking harder and harder about ways in which we in the West try to project our own ideas and aspirations and hopes for what the internet could deliver into actual news events, and trying to figure out what would be the consequences of, say, the Iranian government actually believing in some of those myths that appear in CNN and elsewhere about the Twitter revolution or some other new media facilitated uprising. At the same time, we saw that Hillary Clinton embraced something called Internet Freedom Agenda. Right? In January 2010, we saw that the United States government announced more or less a new pillar to its foreign policy called Internet Freedom. And I think that was the highlight of the confused thinking about the internet that was happening at the government at the time. If you look at that initial speech very carefully, you'll see that, first of all, it frames the issue of internet freedom in one particular way. Mostly it talks about the importance of circumventing government filtering. Circumventing, bans on certain websites. That's more or less how most people in Washington have visualized and thought about internet freedom for a very long time. I think it is ultimately the wrong perspective on internet freedom because the number of threats and the kinds of threats posed to internet freedom at this point are much wider than just banning websites. And they've documented it's things like cyber attacks, it's increasing use of surveillance. Some of that surveillance, by the way, supplied by Western firms, American firms and European firms who supply technology, initially developed for Western law enforcement agencies, initially developed for FBI and NSA and MI6 and others, supplying them to authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, to Central Asia, or elsewhere, where of course these tools are being used completely outside of any legal frameworks that we tend to expect, at least in theory, in the West. That was not mentioned in the first speech that Hillary Clinton gave. It was not mentioned in the second speech. And so far, the kind of thinking that has guided US policy on this issue, as I've said, has been somewhat shallow. A lot of it, particularly in the first speech, operated with extremely outdated metaphors derived, I would argue, from the Cold War, where the United States government and a lot of policymakers did have experiences similar, but not all that similar to what we are facing now, with problems like radio jamming. For example, when the US was broadcasting Radio Free Europe and Voice of America to places like Eastern Europe, and those governments were trying to jam it, and many people in Washington are still returning to those experiences to think that, well, it's something helpful when we need to address the problem of internet control. I think this paradigm is somewhat limited. And it's very wrong, I would argue, to start framing the problem that we have now as a problem of breaking through firewalls, which of course derives primarily from the metaphor of walls and the Berlin Wall. If you actually go and read Clinton's first speech, you would discover that there are a lot of analogies there that try to describe the current situation with bloggers as the situation we had 20 years ago with dissidents. So bloggers now become the producers of samizdat. We see that they are also being increasingly seen as dissidents. And I think that this is a very harmful perspective because, again, it tends to ascribe certain democratic qualities to users of the internet, which those users don't necessarily share. In my own studies of bloggers and blogospheres in places like Russia, China, or Iran, I actually found that plenty of bloggers there are very supportive of their government. Some of them are actually much more aggressive than their governments in foreign policy. Many of their discussions, for example, discussions about Japan or South Korea in the Chinese blogosphere, actually end up enabling a more aggressive foreign policy to the Chinese government. There are many dissimilarities which we need to be aware of, because ultimately the expectations that we have for the internet should be different from the expectations we had for the role of information during the Cold War. And that also means that the accents that we need to place on future policies need to be different. I would argue that we really need to engage with the fact that so much of internet infrastructure, both on the hardware and software level, is provided by private companies who have their own interests and their own agendas, and those agendas don't necessarily always overlap with the agendas of promoting democracy or at least defending human rights. While I wouldn't say that the internet has definitely made it easier to be a dictator, I think that would be a somewhat ridiculous statement, I would argue that in 5 or 10 years, it's very easy for me to imagine the kind of an internet that would actually make the life of dictators much easier than it is today. And that would be the internet that will be dominated by real name policies, where we would not be able to do anything unless you log in with your Facebook account, as already happens on many blogs and, for example, music streaming services like Spotify. It will be an internet which is tightly integrated with all sorts of biometric technologies, including facial recognition, where whenever you go out and protest and the government takes your photo, they actually manage to look you up pretty easily, because there are entire search engines that focus on faces and images. Technologies will be built by Western companies that, again, will make it even easier to spy on Skype calls and any other forms of communications. I mean, for me, it's very easy to imagine all of those things because many of them are already happening. And I think the challenge for the US policy in the future is, how do we make sure that those things don't happen? And how do we make sure that companies like Google and Facebook and Twitter don't get a free pass on the kind of policies they want to implement on their own websites just because we think that they have played a role in their upstream, right? And this is, I think, is a very key issue, because we do treat those companies very favorably. The way we treat Google or Facebook is very different than we treat, say, ExxonMobil or Halliburton. We don't treat Google like a typical company. We treat them more as an NGO. The way we treat Google is much closer to the way in which we treat Human Rights Watch than the way in which we treat ExxonMobil. And I think it's, in many respects, helpful. It's definitely helpful to Google, and in some respects it's probably justified. I just don't think that that's the kind of attitude that we want to cultivate in our policymakers, especially as these companies play an increasingly growing role in the foreign policy interests of the United States and Western Europe. So for me, the big issue and challenge facing Washington is figuring out how to structure its relationship with Silicon Valley, which may be an interesting example of this West-East Coast collaboration that you've outlined. But it's also trying to figure out how to make sure that when Washington actually relies on Silicon Valley, when it actually tries to cultivate a relationship with Google or Facebook, those sites are not perceived as just agents of American power, as they are perceived in parts of the Middle East, Central Asia, and elsewhere. Whenever we use a term like Twitter revolution to talk about what happened in Egypt or what happened in Iran, the implications are pretty clear. I mean, governments in those countries became increasingly concerned that those sites, those services are just a cover-up for spreading America's values and America's agenda, which, you know, in some sense they are. And that, of course, hits the users and creates all sorts of other problems, because those governments try to ban those sites. They try to create websites of their own that compete with Facebook and Google. And they create all sorts of hurdles for users and for anyone who is concerned with the long-term implications of the sites as means of, say, American soft power. So there is a big dilemma here, and on this I'll stop. On the one hand, we want to ensure that Silicon Valley does not build tools that allow dictators to suppress their own people, while on the other hand, we also want to make sure that while we cooperate with Silicon Valley, we do not enhance the perception that Facebook, Twitter, and Google are there just to promote American interests. And it's a very tricky situation for the State Department to be in, and I think that so far the policy of internet freedom has not been deep enough to actually engage with either of those challenges. Thank you so much.
All right, I'm going to immediately invite Jillian to step up.
So I hope that no one was looking for a robust debate, because unfortunately I actually agree with probably 99% of what Evgeny just said, and so instead...
What's the 1%?
No, okay, 100% sure. So instead I'm going to take a bit of a narrower view and look at 2011 in the context of the Middle East and North Africa to sort of, sharpen some of the points that he talked about in very specific ways. So earlier this year, somebody asked me the question if I thought, personally, that what happened in Egypt and Tunisia would have happened without the internet. Now, that's not really a question that any of us can answer, I don't think, and I know that I'm sure there are hundreds of academics working on that very question at this moment, but the truth is, I don't think it's that simple, and I also think that there's something incredibly dangerous about ascribing so much credit to Twitter and to these tools rather than to the people. But I think that for most of the people in this room, that's probably an obvious thought. So instead, I will talk briefly about what I think some of those factors are, and then why that happened, and then what the dilemmas are moving forward, particularly in that region. So, I mean, for one, you're looking at particularly with Egypt and Tunisia, when you look at why those were successful, or in the case of Egypt, semi-successful, and compare that to, say, Libya, where internet played virtually no role, or Syria, where there have been obvious issues recently with surveillance and other things, you're looking at these very different sort of geopolitical situations. With Egypt and Tunisia, you had countries that were largely under the hand of the United States, where the opposition was somewhat of a majority, which is not true in Syria or elsewhere, with relatively high internet penetration in the 30% to 20% somewhat range, lots of media triangulation, which has been talked about a lot elsewhere, so I won't get into that, but then also this really robust history in those particular two countries of digital activism. In Egypt, you had 10 years of history in the anti-torture movement of using these tools to create and enact change. In Tunisia, it was free expression, and the reasons behind that are also really interesting. If you look at Tunisia, you have a country that was heavily censoring almost every video sharing site, political opposition sites, foreign news websites, human rights, etc. In Egypt, you had a country where there wasn't a whole lot of censorship, but where the government would find ways to go after bloggers, detain them, and threaten them, and intimidate them. And so, when it comes to what happened earlier this year and later this year and in the past in terms of restrictions on the internet, you saw sort of a dictator's dilemma, right? You had Egypt, which decided to shut down the internet. And by the way, it was not the first country to do so. There were 3 before it. But it was obviously the most prominent example, and I think possibly the longest amount of time. And then you had Tunisia, which instead of shutting down the internet, actually opened it up in the very final hours of Ben Ali's rule, only to have him ousted anyway. And so those 2 examples have kind of served as an even more dangerous example for the countries to follow. And as we've seen with Syria, I can tell you as somebody who researches internet censorship, a year ago Syria had no clue what it was doing. They were blocking some websites, but when I was there in 2009, I went to try to go to Blogspot, which is, Blogspot. Blogger was not blocked, so you could write on a blog, you just couldn't read it on .blogspot.com. And also Blogspot, the misspelling of Blogspot was blocked, so they weren't particularly savvy, and yet somehow this year they've managed to put all of these surveillance and censorship tools in place to much more heavily censor the internet, to conduct man-in-the-middle attacks on Facebook and other sites, and of course to surveil their citizens with, as Evgeny mentioned, the use of American-built tools. Which brings me to my next point in terms of US policy, which basically has been framed in contradiction and hypocrisy, if I couldn't put too fine a point on it. What you have is Syria, I'm going to talk about Syria strictly for a minute. Syria has been under some pretty heavy export controls over the past few years, and in 2010, the US State Department sent a tech delegation to Syria, comprised of a number of prominent companies, I can't recall which, but mostly Silicon Valley. Microsoft was certainly amongst them. And the idea was to bring these companies to Syria and show them the potential market that they had there, and sort of dangle this carrot over Syria and say, okay, if you don't censor the internet so much, which they were doing at the time, but not very well, as I mentioned. If you don't censor the internet so much, you can have this commerce. Because, as you probably know, Syria has been heavily sanctioned for the past, well, who knows how many years, but particularly since 2004. And what happened after that was that nothing happened. Syria continued to censor, the US continued to do nothing, and in terms of the export restrictions on Syria, I'm sure that there are differing opinions as to sanctions and whether they're a good idea more generally, but when it comes to sanctions on technology, what has occurred in Syria, and also to a different degree in Iran and elsewhere, is that Syrians cannot get access to basic tools. They cannot get web hosting for their blogs. They cannot get Google Earth or Google Chrome. They're barred from entering the Googleplex. If they want to go visit Google, you have to sign a form, and Syria is one of the countries of which citizens cannot enter Google. I'm sure that they make exceptions for academics, but nonetheless. So that's one thing, but at the same time, in the past few weeks, we've seen that Bluecoat, a company based in Silicon Valley, has been exporting, through circuitous methods, their tools to Syria. And whether or not they knew what they were doing, they did know through their own sort of systems and the way they work, and I'm not going to get into that, but they did eventually realize that, yes, in fact, these tools are in Syria. And also today a report was released that showed that Al-Manar, Hezbollah's television station, which is on the special designated terrorist list for the US, has websites hosted in the US. And also that would be under sanctions, and yet, you can't get Google Earth, but you can host a terrorist site in the US. That's great. On the other hand, you've got the censorship rhetoric too. In Clinton's first speech, it was China and Iran, and China and Iran, and China and Iran. And yes, China and Iran both censor the internet heavily, but so does Syria, and so did Tunisia, and so does Vietnam. And those countries have gone mostly ignored because they're not foreign policy priorities. You also have, at the same time, you had Tunisia being used as a test ground for US products. Cisco, SmartFilter, all of those companies were using Tunisia to test their products for other countries. And this has been documented by the Tunisian Internet Agency and activists there. I was able to actually go into the Tunisian Internet Agency while I was there last month and see where they used to keep all of their surveillance tools in the basement. It was very creepy. And then I think there are other issues as well, as Evgeny mentioned with the companies, and so I won't get into that too deeply, but you have sort of this prevailing rhetoric right now around banning anonymity, and the US government is not, well, I mean, they are involved in this in many ways, but not the State Department Internet Freedom Initiative specifically. But at the same time, you have companies restricting the ability for users to be anonymous on their platforms, and despite the US government, despite the State Department's sort of rhetoric around online safety and the ability of activists to conduct their activities, there's nothing being said about the fact that companies are restricting people from being anonymous and safe online. And then, of course, more recently with the Stop Online Piracy Act, which I'm sure I can't talk about as well as some of my colleagues in the audience can, and so I'm not going to, but an act that is meant to, in theory, sort of stop intellectual property violations, but in practice would restrict internet freedom, and Clinton has been pretty silent on it, in fact, sort of tacitly endorsing it in a way. The really ironic part of this act is that it would prevent circumvention tools and proxies from being used in the US, while the State Department put $30 million towards those products last year. The State Department directly funds these products for use by dissidents in other countries, but doesn't want you to use them, apparently. And so I guess to end with that, I think, I don't know what the solutions are. I'm kind of looking at a sort of the future looks bleak aspect, but I don't want to stay that way. I think that when it comes to the issue of surveillance technology being exported from the US, I think that is one of the trickiest questions right now, and I think that regulation is incredibly complex and possibly a bad idea. As we've seen, these agencies that regulate export at the moment, Commerce and Treasury, have not done a very good job, in my opinion, particularly with what I mentioned before vis-a-vis Syria. And so would I trust them to accurately regulate the sale of surveillance technology while not putting more restrictive measures on other technologies? I don't think I would. And so it's a tough question there, and I think that what it comes down to for me is not so much recommendations for the US government, because I'm not sure that they will ever be able to divorce their foreign policy from their ideology about internet freedom, or from their rhetoric rather. But so for me, a lot of it comes down to user safety and empowerment. In terms of surveillance, knowing how to protect yourself or defend yourself against surveillance. In terms of bad company policies, being aware of those policies and being able to effectively speak out and lobby against them. And sometimes that might mean going through government routes. And then I guess in terms of the last bit, I think that, as Evgeny mentioned at the end, I can't overstate enough that how important it is to have better policy toward companies. If you look at where we conduct our activity online, we think of the internet as this great public sphere, but it's not. It's owned by private companies largely. And so when you go on Facebook or when you go on Twitter, you're abiding by their rules, and their rules are not compliant with the First Amendment, on Twitter mostly, but the rest of them not so much. And so, there has been very little move toward ensuring that, but that's where all of this activity takes place, both here and abroad for the most part. And so I would rather see better policies being enacted towards Silicon Valley than looking at, say, going to Egypt to train activists on how to use the internet. I think civil society would do a better job of that. I don't think that that's the US government's place. And so I suppose I will close with that in mind, just in terms of thinking about some of these key issues around free expression, privacy, and anonymity, and what companies and what policy toward companies can do to fix that.
Okay, I am going to let Evgeny and Jillian open it up for each other, and I'm inviting them each to ask the other a question and providing a little bit of time to see if we can get a conversation going among the two of you.
I have a question. I don't know if you.
All right, go ahead.
So let me run a theory by you and then see what you make of it. So there are some people who think that the fact that Egyptian activists have relied on the internet so much in the run-up to the revolution has created an extremely effective decentralized movement that was extremely instrumental and worked really well in getting people out on January 25th and the days that followed. But because of this decentralized nature and because of its literalist structure, it was not able to effectively counter the army, the Muslim Brotherhood, and all sorts of other players who were much better prepared, were centralized, had leaders, and did not actually rely on that much online deliberation, if any. So to what extent do you think the internet has actually been a hindrance to the movement after the revolution? And what your advice would be to prospective revolutionaries elsewhere, depending on how you answer it?
That's a very good question. I think it's interesting because if you look at the way the Egyptian revolution started, which I don't even know that I can necessarily answer that question. If you ask the New York Times, they would say it was Wael Ghonim. If you ask me, I would say that it was the 10 years of activism and social movements leading up to that. But whatever it was, you had a large number of people who came out on that first day on January 25th and took to the streets. And then from there it began to build and build and build. What I would say to that is that, as much as I respect and admire and really do believe in the power of those social movements that have existed for the past decade, I do think that they're a tiny minority, and I think that that has become clear as the revolution has moved forward and as we've seen the military crack down. It's a very small number of people left standing. And so what I would say to that is, I think that's where slacktivism comes in, is that, which is not to say that anyone who walked into Tahrir Square was a slacker. I'm certainly not denigrating them like that. But there are a lot of people who are not activists who joined into that because it was strength in numbers, who have now dropped off. And so as we've seen the Egyptian military try over 12,000 civilians civilians since January, true, and including bloggers. We've seen very, very little movement now against that. And yes, there are very strong core movements, but they don't have the same mass appeal as before. And so I think that that's the hindrance. I think that people see themselves as joining into something and may go out in the street, and that may be true here too. I think we have yet to see what's going to happen with the Occupy movements. But I think people join up, they join when there's strength in numbers, and after there's some sort of victory or some sort of loss, you end up losing followers. And I think that, I don't know what my recommendation would be moving forward with that. I mean, I think...
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
So, do you think Evgeny was delusional when he decided to start an NGO to eradicate poverty with the help of technology instead of forming a political party? Yeah. And he also decided to write a book, but you know,
Right.
is it the right time to be writing books and founding NGOs about poverty in Egypt, or should he have thrown his political capital behind forming a new political movement? And you know, that opens up an entire new field of debate because, for example, in Europe, now we see a lot of political movements, primarily based around the Pirate Party in Sweden and in Germany, that take digital issues seriously and then actually are prepared to participate in politics. I mean, of course, Egypt is a slightly different case, but wouldn't one of the prospective recommendations then be you should guys get engaged with politics, or you still think that internet will suffice in one way or another? Well, they should just live it to. Who do they live it to then?
Right. Well, I want to go easy on Wael Ghonim because I think that he was an accidental activist. Just in case this is not clear, he is the guy who started the We Are All Khaled Saeed Facebook page, which ended up being the catalyst for people going out onto the streets on January 25th. But I don't think he ever intended to be a leader of a movement, and I think that that was sort of apparent in his initial anonymity. In terms of his personal decisions, I mean, I think I understand why anyone would do what he has done, which is not to go into politics. But at the same time, I do think that there have been some of the prominent activists in Egypt have sort of been unwilling to engage in politics, and I do think, from my stance, and I also kind of understand why they've made decisions that they've made, but from my stance, I do think that someone with that sort of clout could be doing more than say, I would say that this probably was not the right time to write the book. But at the same time, the last bit that you said, I wanted to comment on that.
Political parties.
Oh, yeah, I mean, in terms of political parties, I want to make sure I understood what you said about the pirate parties, but, it's interesting, there's one country, and I feel like I don't want to name it because I just don't, but there's one country where I know some of the folks who are trying to start a pirate party in that country, and it's a country where this will be a very, very, no. I mean, that's happening too, but that's not the one I'm talking about. You're not going to guess it. It's a country where it's going to be a very controversial thing, and one of their
United States.
No. One of their challenges, though, is being seen as more than just a digital rights party. In the country that they're in, they need to ensure that they can engage with the conservative populace, and that means moving beyond freedom of expression, moving beyond some of the digital issues, and actually being able to respond to some of the broader issues, especially when you're talking about a country that has all sorts of other challenges. I think the pirate parties in Europe, it's a little bit different because you're not dealing with the same sorts of issues that you might be dealing with in a more restricted country. But I do think that it does help to be able to engage more broadly in politics than just in the digital rights space.
Jillian, I'm going to invite you to ask a question.
All right. Well, so your book came out at about the same time that the Egyptian Revolution started, and I mean, I have read your book and I find it to also be incredibly valuable. But I think in terms of the framing of it, or at least the perceived framing of it, I think a lot of people saw it as a sort of quashing of the idea that these movements could happen using digital tools, and then when they did, it was like, look at that. But honestly, I mean, I think you're right, and I think that in some cases they're right too. And so what I want to ask is, moving forward, what do you think the potentials are of some of these movements, and what do you think that they need to be doing to sort of move out of that pigeonhole of sort of Twitter revolutions?
Sure, well, it's a lot of questions packed in one. So to answer the question about the book first, I think yes, there is a large misperception about what I was trying to accomplish. For example, when I talk about the failure of the revolution in Iran, what's most interesting to me is not why it failed and the role the technology played in it or didn't play in it, but it's why we in the West have chosen to interpret it in a certain way while the evidence was pointing to completely different narrative, right? The evidence from Iran, you know, and as you may know, I quote that figure in the book, Al Jazeera did fact-checking on the ground in Iran during the revolution and could identify only 60 active users of Twitter on the ground in June 2009, which of course stands in stark contrast to the claims of millions of Iranians using Twitter, you know, going through the streets of Tehran. So for me, the big interesting question is why would CNN tell that story that way? And you know, the easy, silly answer is that, well, because they're stupid, right? But I think there is something deeper there, and something there does tell us a story about how we think about technology and how we think about the connection between technology and democratization. I mean, there is a whole set of cultural arguments that have nothing to do with technology, which have nothing to do with actually politics and foreign policy that are of interest to me, that connect to a much broader intellectual tradition and philosophy of technology. Now, what does it all mean for social movements and for the promotion of democracy in general? I think there are a couple of things. And here again, I have to fight against a very, I think, deep misunderstanding of, for example, my argument about slacktivism. And, you know, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, it's basically a somewhat pejorative term to describe activists who are also slackers. So activists who are slackers are now slacktivists who change the world from their couches by, you know, pushing buttons on their, well, not buttons now, even just pushing screen, I guess, on their iPads. So the argument I was making was not that Facebook and Twitter are not important, or that they fail to mobilize people, or that once you publicize something on Twitter, people would never show up. I mean, no, that was not the argument I was making. What was of interest to me is the connection between these new virtual movements, some of which are disconnected from the political reality of their countries, and the actual political process. And my example there was what was happening in Belarus at the time. And in Belarus for quite a few years, ever since, I would say actually, ever since the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, for probably the last 6 years or so, there has been a lot of excitement about the power of new media and the internet and technology to bring political change. And if you know anything about Belarus, you probably know that the actual opposition movement in Belarus is extremely weak. Through various interventions by the government, it has been weakened considerably, and no one in their right mind among young people would want to associate with the opposition movement, in part because they're just so goddamn ineffective. And for many young people, it has become something of a plausible alternative, that they can actually hang out on various forums and blogs and LiveJournal and, you know, take a photo of the president and draw a funny mustache and then claim it as the greatest political achievement in oppositional politics. And I don't want that kind of politics to persist. I mean, I know that it may help to undermine credibility of the government, if there was any. I know it may be an interesting way to express dissent. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons why we should be studying those forms of dissent from a purely normative perspective of someone concerned with bringing some kind of democratization to Belarus. I would rather have those people, young people, think about ways how to integrate and change that extremely ineffective opposition movement instead of trying to completely bypass it. And this is where my concerns are. It's not in the fact that Facebook or Twitter are ineffective in mobilizing people. It's that they provide new means of doing politics, but the politics that they enable are often inferior to other kinds of politics that are far more expensive and challenging, but they actually work. And that also explains the question I asked you about Egypt, because I myself think that it was too much expectation. If you go and actually read some of the online debates and statements by all of our favorite technology enthusiasts and gurus in America and elsewhere expressed around February and March with regards to Egypt, all of them were full of these plans of how we can actually get together and start using wikis and Facebook to engage in deliberative democracy in Egypt and come up with new legislative agendas and whatnot. Well, great. Again, it's a nice exercise in theory, but in reality, something else needed to happen. They should have forming political parties and trying to do something about the army staying on in office forever, instead of trying to think about how we can bring more Silicon Valley culture to, executive meetings in Egypt. I mean, that was not the right thing to do. So that's the critique that I've been trying to make, and I think largely it does stem from us having certain expectations about the internet and thinking that the internet will have certain political and social consequences if only we let it run free. And that's the kind of narrative I'm pushing against.
Okay. Well, we've already got a lot to think about. I'm going to take the prerogative of the moderator and ask the first question, and then I'm going to invite you all to join in. I don't know if there's a microphone for the audience. In fact, there is. And my guess is that Professor Rule is going to want you to use it so that we get your question recorded for posterity. Evgeny, much of your book puts up what I believe to be a bit of a straw man. I worked at the Electronic Frontier Foundation very early on in my career when we did have kind of the manifest destiny, the internet is going to make us all free and it's completely unregulable. But most of the advocates and the activists have stepped back from such, internet utopianism. But the pushback against kind of technological determinism, I think, is a key aspect of your book, and a push to say that no, when we think about technology, we have to think about the way it's embedded in a social and economic system, and that we should care about how it relates to how we govern and how we police, etc. So I think it was still really interesting that in your opening remarks, you said that 5 to 10 years from now, the internet is going to be much better for dictators, right? We're going to have real name policies, we're going to have integrated biometrics, we're going to have more surveillance technology, unless, and I think much of the conversation that we ought to be having here today is unless what, right? And you pushed very hard on kind of the special treatment that some of the high-tech companies, or your perceptions that the high-tech companies are getting. And I don't think anybody would dispute that there is some special treatment. And yet, I want to ask whether or not there might be some basis for that special treatment. One, historically, both in the US and in international arenas, we've seen the technology companies actually forge common ground with the civil liberties community and the human rights community. In the US, that's the basis of our Electronic Communications Privacy Act. Fighting things like the Cybercrime Convention, all of those have been integrated efforts by the high-tech community and the civil liberties and human rights community. And most significantly, in this particular arena, when we talk about international human rights, the Global Network Initiative, which I'm part of, EFF is part of, and others, it's this very interesting, so that when we think about the role of companies and typically the way in which regulatory governments and the NGO community come together to push them to do differently, to behave more in line with community norms, we actually have this very peculiar arrangement in the high-tech sector in relation to NGOs and activists right now, in that they're aligning and trying to get governments to act in ways that are more consistent with international human rights norms. So we have this bizarre switch in roles. And so I want to, kind of invite you to say, so if we are at some tipping point, right, and we have choices to be made about whether or not the internet is going to be what Lewis Mumford would refer to as a democratic technology, right, rather than an authoritarian technology, to the extent that we might believe such things, that if we want to take the properties of technical artifacts seriously, and I think both of you do, what is the role of the private sector and what is the role of the government? And as people who are in the position to ask them to do things, what do you want them to do?
Sure. First of all, I would challenge your reading of my book.
No, I haven't read the whole thing.
Well, that helps my case then. But again, I think it's very wrong to assume that my goal is to have an argument with technology experts, EFF, or no, but again, that's not, I know that those people are smart, I know that they know much more than I do, that's why I'm not having an argument with them, because they are not the ones to be convinced.
No, and I wasn't suggesting that you would. I'm
No,
sorry.
but there are plenty of people who suggest that. There are plenty of people
Not
who
me.
fault me for, well, again, I just,
How were you guys?
no, I just want to, because it's a very important point, because it's important to understand that my real targets are people who have very shallow understanding of technology, who sit in Washington and who sit on various foreign policy committees in DC, who sit in entities like National Endowment for Democracy, International Republican Institute, National Democratic Institute, all sorts of foundations, who are very influential players in this space, who have far more impact on the future of democracy in a country like Belarus than EFF ever will. That's why I'm talking to those people. I'm not talking to EFF, because primarily my interest in liberating Belarus, it's not in liberating the internet. And that's a very important point to keep in mind.
So what do you
right?
want those important organizations to do?
Again, in the book, I outline an intellectual framework, which primarily starts, yes, but it's consistent with my argument. So in the book, my argument is that I provide an actual intellectual framework for decision makers, how they can actually learn about what's happening on the ground. What we have seen so far is that an entity like the State Department, an entity like the National Endowment for Democracy, hired a bunch of guys, mostly from Silicon Valley, who are perceived as internet gurus, who basically sit and read news about the internet and then try to think how this cool technology from Berkeley or Stanford can work in Syria or Iran. I think it's a fundamentally wrong move, because it has to start with the needs of people in Syria or the needs of people in Iran. So what I would want to do is to actually fire all internet gurus and start with people who are actually regional experts. And it's a very important point. I mean, even in the State Department, you have a huge split, traditional in many issues, between people who are regional experts, who are experts in China, Russia, Middle East, and people who are topical experts, who know something about human rights, who know something about nuclear weapons issue, who know something about public health. And I think the internet as such does not yet lend itself to such a topical treatment. That's why I'm against the very idea of internet freedom as embraced by the State Department, because I think our intellectual understanding of this space is not enough and is inadequate for us to start treating the issue of the internet as we treat the issue of human rights. In part, again, because so many things are in flux and I don't have the answers. Again, I don't think that anyone in Silicon Valley has an answer except for cybersecurity contractors, as how to deal with the problem of cybercrime, right? And I do think that in the future, it may be that people will come together and have a referendum and say, hey, we want more control over the internet and we want to restructure the networks.
Okay.
It will be a terrible reaction from the EFF. I don't think it will be undemocratic. And again, if you look at, for example, what happened last week, you had a big survey in Britain where people were asked, what would you want to do, what would you want the government to do if you have another series of riots which are organized by technology? BlackBerry, Twitter, Facebook, whatever. You know, more than half, I think close to 60%, said that they would actually want to shut the internet down. Again, I'm not saying that that's what we need to do, but there is a way for us to incorporate those kind of decisions which will be made democratically very often, and we just don't have any kind of intellectual framework yet.
Indeed.
In the interest of spreading democracy, I think this is the moment for questions from the floor.
Actually, I'd like to say something as well, quickly, very quickly.
Very quickly.
Short. Yeah, I mean, I kind of want to challenge the whole idea that these companies deserve the special treatment that they're getting. Google yesterday talking about the Stop Online Piracy Act. Oh, like, yeah, we don't like this. We don't want to, block websites, but why don't you just, financially run them dry? I'm not okay with them saying that, and I'm not okay with them doing that within the context of the special treatment that they get normally. I think Facebook is another great example, and you know, they've essentially gone rogue. Facebook, you know, has, when Randy Zuckerberg, Mark Zuckerberg's sister, was working for Facebook, she was running around going, let's put a stop to online anonymity. And they've got all sorts of power. And actually, you know what, I'm going to say also with the GNI, I think that the GNI does lots and lots of wonderful things. I'm not answering that. No, I think GNI has a lot of great value to it, but I also think, and I'm going to say this on a personal level because I wasn't at EFF when you made the decision to join anyway, so I can't say, but all I can say is that, you know, GNI, in terms of censorship, they say that they want to minimize rather than stop censorship, and that's something that I disagree with. I don't think that a US company should be censoring abroad, or in the US for that matter. And so, you know, I mean, I think that when you look at, say, Google going into China, I think that there's a lot of benefit to them being there even if they censor. But I still don't think that they should be in that position. And furthermore, in terms of the sort of, you know, the net freedom policy and particularly the funding, you've seen this 30 million or billion? Million, thank you. Yeah, it's like a childhood thing. You saw it go to circumvention tools and training. Now, the only research, and granted I was a part of it, so challenge it all you want, but the only research I've seen on users of circumvention tools in heavily censored countries suggests that only 3% are using them anyway. So why are we pouring all of this money into that? Why are we giving the NDI, the National Democratic Institute, all this money to start an Arab bloggers network when a grassroots one already exists? This is the kind of craziness where there's no regional expertise coming in, and they're not listening to people on the ground, and so you end up with all of these fluff projects that get all sorts of funding from state.
So we have some deep arguments for a much more grounded consideration of the role of technology. Audience in the middle there.
Okay, thank you. My question is about the content of the internet from the point of view of the dissents in various countries. I only have one anecdote from the Tunisians when the one hip-hop artist in Tunisia, whose name I think was El General,
yep.
He did a hip-hop address to the president, which was like a letter to the president. And it was reciting all the crimes against the president. But it was so popular among the youth that, of course, he was arrested and he was asked, if we release you, will you stop the people from chanting this hip-hop? And of course, they released him, but he couldn't stop it because it had become a part of the internet feed and so forth and so on. So my question is, do you have information about how significant was hip-hop in other countries in terms of, we're not talking about, you know, whether or not someone has the right to use the internet, but as Marshall McLuhan said, the message is the medium. No, he said medium is the message. I know he said all kind of buts, right. But I think the point is, though, that the message is the medium, because if you have something to say, you can put it on a drum or smoke signal, and people will react to it. So what is the report on hip-hop in other countries? I know that Tunisia was significant because the American government invited hip-hop artists from America to go to Tunisia to connect with them. So
I can actually answer that, oddly enough. Because the State Department also funds the hip-hop diplomacy projects, which is crazy if you don't know about it, but it's totally true. In Morocco in 2005, the U.S. Embassy in Morocco funded a project called I Love Hip Hop in Morocco. And it was a Fulbright student from the U.S. who went and put on these series of concerts. And they were Moroccan artists as well as bringing in American artists. And I think it had a profound effect on the hip-hop scene in Morocco. But what's funny about it is that I don't think it, I mean, I do think it's influenced sort of the free expression movements there, definitely. But at the same time, a lot of the hip-hop artists in Morocco are extreme nationalists in the sense that they also believe in the Western Sahara being part of Morocco, whereas, you know, it's obviously a contentious area. And so in terms of like mobilizing political opposition, not so much. In terms of its connection to the internet, I mean, I think that's interesting because I think that a lot of the hip-hop groups in the Middle East and North Africa, and I can't speak beyond that region in terms of this, have really effectively use the internet in two different ways. The first is to get their content out, translated and public globally, but the second is a lot of them are licensing their stuff under Creative Commons. A lot of them are putting their stuff out there for free for anyone to download and anyone to see. And I think that that has a profound effect on just sort of the way people view the internet in most countries. But beyond that, I think that's about the limit of my comment.
Can I actually say something about hip-hop? I'm just, not often I get questions like that. It will be in line with what I said about the authoritarian counter-reaction. You actually see in Russia hip-hop now playing a very interesting role where you see a lot of performers engaging in very sharp social criticism, particularly attacking high-level bureaucrats and corporate guys who in Russia have a very special status. And of course, Kremlin's response to this so far has been to try to co-opt the hip-hop movement, where you see Vladimir Putin showing up at hip-hop conventions and saying things like breakdancing and hip-hop are optimistic, if that sounds optimistic, but...
I think the same thing you just said is true of some of the US funding of activists in the region as well. It gives them a bigger platform than their perhaps more effective counterparts at times.
Can we take another question? Oh boy. I'm going to let Professor Rule determine whose question.
I'm just curious as to whether any of you would like to, has any information about or would like to comment on the use of the internet currently by the people either in the Occupy movement in this country or the government or police.
I don't have any
Unless you had occupied territories, you know, to which I was prepared. No, I can't.
Yeah, I really can't either. I apologize. I'm actually very blind when it comes to US issues lately because I've been out of the country so much. I'm sorry. Which doesn't mean to say that I'm not following.
But I can point you to an excellent article that appeared in The Atlantic yesterday by Alex Madrigal, which actually documents the use of technology by Occupied Wall Street movement. It's on their website.
I would also endorse that article.
Another question.
We just don't read them, we just, you know, tweet about it.
Yeah.
So I heard some, what sounded like bashing of censorship circumvention software. Maybe it wasn't. So if I could just get everybody's take on the value of it or the lack of value of it.
I think that it is important. I think circumvention software is very important. I think a lot of the existing circumvention software is both unsafe and often, you know, will let somebody get to the BBC, but will not exactly keep them protected from surveillance. And so, you know, I mean, EFF obviously, and I personally advocate for Tor, which is an anonymity tool that also provides circumvention. But I would also say to that, you know, there are a lot of reasons people don't use it, including the fact that when you're running on like Lebanese bandwidth, it's so slow that you can't do anything. And so to that extent, you know, I mean, I think that there are a lot of ways that people use these tools and a lot of ways that people get around them, and I don't think anyone's done good research at this point, but I think that the funding of these really, really specific tools, when there are so many just free proxies online, that's what, you know, when I go to certain countries, Syria is actually one of them, people are mostly using, if they're not using Tor, they're mostly using these free web proxies. And so when you look at all of the funding of these other sort of competitors, I think that they would be better off sort of looking toward first, I mean, doing a really, really strong technical audit of all of these tools, but then second, kind of, you know, funding a smaller number of more effective tools rather than trying to diversify the landscape in that way.
The other thing is that, again, you have to start with a question of what internet freedom is an answer to. And for me, it's an answer to the problem of internet control. You know, and as I tried to say in my remarks, that internet control takes many other forms than filtering. And the problem is that not everyone who votes on allocating you know, those funds understands that there are many other problems than the internet filtering, right? Politicians in Washington think that the main problem is the Great Firewall of China and all we need to do is to destroy it. And what also happens is that you have a lot of entities and organizations that have built huge lobbying practices to influence the certain votes, right? So you have an entity affiliated with the Falun Gong movement from China, which is trying to raise good money for their own projects, which have not been audited, as far as I know, in an open manner, which sometimes are faulty. But because they have clout on the hill, and because they have the money to lobby, their tools end up getting a lot of funding, even though no one is sure why and for what reason. So again, traditional and conventional politics spoils the nice circumvention story that otherwise may have been told.
Another question in the back?
I can sympathise with your cultural sort of isolation, perhaps. I'm Australian, and there was a documentary that's been released on the BBC earlier this year by a filmmaker called Adam Curtis, and the series of movies was called All Watched Over by Machines of Love and Grace. And in that he talks about the Californian ideology and the internet and the merger of libertarianism and techno-utopianism. And I suggest people actually download that, torrent that, because it's not available as far as I know. My question is specifically to Google Ideas and a gentleman called Jared Cohen, who has left the State Department, where he pioneered, I think it's called Statecraft for the 21st Century. He's now working at Google Ideas. And Google's got a reputation for being a cuddly sort of internet machine, but I saw that they're recently starting to fund right-wing causes. And I just wonder about Statecraft for the 21st Century and Google Ideas.
Well,
I'm going to let you let this one go.
I watched the film. I didn't find it terrific, so I wouldn't advise you to download it, but you know, that's just my personal opinion. Google Ideas, it's a weird initiative. Basically, the way it's positioned, that it's a think tank within Google that thinks about geopolitics and thinks about the future of foreign policy and whatnot. So far, it's actually positioned much better than a think tank. It's positioned as a do tank. I don't think they've done much since they started, but it's very hard to understand what it is and what it does. They convened a conference that sought to promote anti-radicalization of young people. It's not really obvious how it connects to Google's core mission and what they're trying to do. That said, it's a pet project of Eric Schmidt, who in his new role at Google is trying to influence governments rather than engineers, and having such an entity is probably very beneficial. I think, from my personal opinion on this, is that it probably hurts Google more than it helps, particularly the publicity that surrounds this entity, and it surrounds this entity for all sorts of reasons that have to do with Jared Cohen and Eric Schmidt and their upcoming book. But it positions Google as a certain kind of actor that is interested in geopolitics and that is interested in questions of freedom and questions of democratization, which I think is a very silly thing for Google, because ultimately it hurts their bottom line and they start getting problems in places like Iran, Russia, and we know the China situation, precisely because they're seen as a political actor and not as a neutral actor as such. So it may be that Google is prepared to face such hit. I think more likely scenario is that they don't know what they're doing.
What's wrong with the Adam Curtis?
I found it's a critique of cyber-utopianism. I just found it very shallow. I mean, it interviews a lot of interesting people, but he could have dug much deeper. But, you know, it's my own.
So I just want to add, so that, were you just suggesting that, I think, Jillian, you said that, right, the GNI should do more. They should say we'd oppose all censorship as opposed to we try to minimize censorship, and you just said Google should do less because it's in conflict with their bottom line. Is there perhaps some tension, something you can debate here?
Again, I don't think there is much tension here, because there is a difference between Google pushing for its own interest and its own agenda, which it does through GNI. Again, I think the reason why Google has joined the Global Network Initiative is partly because an internet that is free and not censored saves Google a lot of money, because they don't have to hire all those people who will be doing the censorship. So, as you pointed out yourself, it's one of those cases where the interests of Google and the interests of the internet overlap. But I don't think that that will be the case forever. And there are many issues like the real name policy that I think, and potential rollout of facial recognition features, which despite all the assurances from Eric Schmidt, I'm sure are coming in a year or two, that will not overlap with what the internet as a civic space requires. And this is why I think we should not assume that just because Google is interested in solving one little bit of the big internet puzzle, they would be interested in solving others. That's why I think I'd rather treat them as ExxonMobil than to treat them as Human Rights Watch. So that answers your earlier question. But with regard to Global Network Initiative, actually I fully agree with Jillian. So far they haven't shown much. And I'm not sure that they actually have the ways to sanction the companies. If you look at what Microsoft has been accused of doing in Russia, for example, when the government was actually going and arresting some of the NGO staff because they were using illegal copies of Microsoft Windows, or what Microsoft has been doing in the past with its Bing search engine in the Middle East, where they were censoring much more heavily than required. It was not within the mandate of GNI. They were clearly violating some implicit, if not explicit norms, and no sanctions followed. So I think those people who are asking whether GNI is just a fig leaf that saves those companies from tighter regulation, I think are asking the right question.
Well, I will say that GNI's auditing functions, etc., are only getting up. But go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say, you know, I do think that things like GNI should exist. So I don't mean to say that they shouldn't. I mean, obviously, my organization is a member, and you know, I think that when it comes to, I mean, I gave a very specific example in the principles, but I actually think that what Evgeny said is a really good point about Microsoft. Microsoft is not doing their part because they're still censoring in every single Arabic-speaking country beyond what any government has ever asked them to do, and nobody's holding them accountable to it, including, I would say, you know, publicly at GNI. I don't know what the process looks like yet, but still, you know, I think that the danger of any sort of initiative like that, and I don't want to speak specifically about that one because I think that there are many in that space, I think the danger is less to the companies. I think most companies can use initiatives like that as a shield, whereas the danger ends up being toward the other participants who, you know, cannot necessarily come out as, or maybe fear coming out as strongly against a company policy. But, you know, I think that in terms of Google Ideas and their sort of desire or not, maybe not desire implicitly or explicitly, but implicit desire to sort of be more activist. It's interesting because I think Facebook has taken the opposite approach. And despite all of my criticisms about Facebook, this has actually worked for them, right? They're only censored in 2 countries. Their Facebook, China and Vietnam. And more recently, again, Syria, although that is contested. You know, whereas like YouTube and Flickr are censored in many, many more. And I don't know, you know, necessarily the reasons behind that, but I think with Facebook, they have intentionally tried to look neutral when it comes to being seen as an activist tool. The only initiative I've ever seen that came off as kind of not neutral was their Peace Initiative, but even that was a Stanford project that was sort of, you know, just kind of done in tandem with them. And even then, it was still fairly neutral. Peace should be neutral. You know, and so I think that, yeah, I mean, I think with Google Ideas and with this sort of, I'm sorry if I'm answering your question again, but the sort of effectiveness of ideas like that comes down to maybe who's there. And I think that that's a big question. I think the radicalization idea might be interesting, but you know, I haven't seen that much coming out of there, and I think that they would be, their money and time would be better spent on other things.
So let's take 2 questions from the audience, and we'll let you all pick.
For equity, I moved to the front of the audience now.
All of you seem to be quite critical of U.S. government policy on internet issues, and I'm wondering if you can point to any example anywhere in the world where you think there's some positive initiatives in terms of dealing at a policy level. I'm sure you're familiar with the Icelandic Modern Media Initiative, and which is an effort to protect freedom of speech on the internet, and actually they say they're trying to provide a haven for people like bloggers from other countries, but who could locate their servers there, and if you think that's positive in what it's trying to do there, or could be a model for other countries.
And let's take one more question, and then...
You choose, Deirdre.
Let's go over here. You get to ask lots of questions.
Okay, so it's kind of, it falls on the previous question, I think. I think the experience in the last year with, no one's mentioned it, but WikiLeaks and the US government's response and alleged by many people cyber attacks of the same style you described in Belarus launched against WikiLeaks. We seem to, of the opposite take, we seem to be taking the US government's supposed desire to promote democracy and freedom and goodness in the world sort of too much at face value from the actual behavior that seems to be happening. So from the perspective of the community of citizens of the United States who might actually believe in those things as opposed to the government of the United States, what do you think that we should be doing? Both, I'm in the College of Engineering, in the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. What are the kinds of things that you think we should be doing, especially in terms of technologists, that could help the forces of good? Or is it just fundamental that governments, because they're bigger and more organized, and corrupt companies and will always have the upper hand, and without direct people power, there's nothing we can do?
Okay.
Sure, I can start. So with regards to other governments, I would say that there are some interesting European efforts, particularly in the Netherlands and in Sweden, to support internet freedom in terms of, again, organizing all sorts of blogging meetings in the Arab world or funding tools like Tor. All of them are copycats of the US policy. And again, those initiatives come from the foreign ministries. There are plenty of initiatives that happen on the grassroots level by NGOs. But if we only limit ourselves to governments, I would say that what's happening in Europe is a bad copy of what's happening in the US. With the minor caveat that Europe often, with minor exceptions, does not carry the same geopolitical baggage as America does, so can operate somewhat more freely. And that doesn't work for, say, France and Tunisia, but in many other places it does. There are some initiatives, again, coming from Brussels. So in the European Parliament, it's probably the only European institution where there has been sustained effort led by a handful of members of the European Parliament to actually ban the export of surveillance tools and technologies to the Arab world. So there is a very active Dutch MEP, who's been extremely pushy in trying to get some kind of official ban on those technologies. It hasn't really worked for all sorts of complicated legal reasons, I think, but they're still talking. With regards to the Icelandic initiative, I think its success and its public success was back to the success of WikiLeaks, which was probably not a smart move on behalf of the people behind it, even though they distanced themselves from WikiLeaks at the right time. I didn't know how much traction this project has at the moment. I didn't know how receptive the Icelandic government and public would be to such initiatives at this point. When it started, it was clearly the right move in the right direction. It's just that the WikiLeaks debate keeps changing so much and so often, and I think that project does have that WikiLeaks background, and it will be sort of contingent on the future of WikiLeaks. With regards to what engineers can do, sorry to be very brutal, switch to political science department. Again, and that's a very, that may be a very offensive thing to say, but I'm consistent with what I say in the blog. I think we have no shortage of smart people in Silicon Valley and elsewhere trying to build all sorts of smart tools to help Iranians. You know, me and Jillian have an experience with one of those tools built last year called Haystack, which, you know, was built by well-meaning engineers who had all good intentions, but as executed, it probably put a lot of Iranians at risk and would actually result in them going to prison, you know, if certain conditions were in place. That's not to say that we have too many engineers, but I think the real big problems that face us are, you know, going to be decided in Washington. And we do need to start thinking about new social and citizen movements that will take the politics of the internet seriously, and that will also be eager to engage with political side, not just with the technological fixes side.
So Evgeny answered the first question really well, and so I'll mostly skip over it, that's really what I was going to say. In terms of the second question, I think what you said about it taking the Internet Freedom Initiative at face value, I think that is the problem, that's the danger. Assuming that the US net freedom policy, which in rhetoric is delightful, but assuming that it's true, is sort of assuming that the U.S. has this sort of sense of goodness is the problem. Like I said, there's been all of this focus on these priority countries that are priorities in foreign policy, but at the same time, up until Obama blocked it under pressure, the U.S. was about to sell arms to Bahrain while Bahrain is using American surveillance to harm its citizens while it's cracking down on protests. And so the fact that the U.S. Makes all of this sort of hullabaloo about Syria, even that's been weak, but then says nothing about their allies in the Gulf, I think that right there tells you what they mean when they have this policy. It is a curtain, it is a shield. I guess, I'm going to disagree with you on two things, just to have some tiny bit of debate. Yeah, but they're not huge disagreements. I feel like they're nitpicks. One is that I actually disagree with what you said about the European government initiatives being bad copies of U.S. foreign policy. In the Netherlands and in Germany, Hivos and the Heinrich Böll Foundation have been doing this longer than Clinton
They're
has
not
been
governments,
talking
they're
about.
funded by governments.
They're
In the
funded
US
by
case, they're not
governments.
governments, they're more foreign ministries.
But
But yes.
they're grant-making organizations that are largely funded by their governments and therefore have political parties. Yeah. Okay, so fair enough, fine. And I also disagree with your recommendation in terms of engineering, which is to say, I only partly disagree, which is to say that I think that engineers make a lot of the decisions that affect our daily lives. And so it's not so much that I think the engineers need to switch to political science, I think that they need the dual background. I think that being an engineer, when you're talking about this sort of quasi-public sphere that the internet has become, you need to also understand the geopolitical implications of the tools that you're creating. And so that would be my recommendation, is to go for the dual.
And as the moderator, I'm going to take the last word. And I'm going to encourage you to come over to the iSchool, where we sit at the nexus of technology and society. And I also just want to close, I think that Jillian's point that taking the internet freedom agenda at face value is incredibly important. It is easy to talk about uncensored access to information. It's much more difficult and complicated when you have engaged in warrantless wiretapping and have spent more money on surveillance technology in the past few years than many other countries have spent over the course of their lifetime to talk about surveillance issues or to talk about cyber attack issues. And also just to note that technology is put out both as a solution to the problems of democracy, the way in which we should reinvigorate it, as well as the way to make our policing more efficient. So either way, Silicon Valley may win. But I think we didn't get quite enough about what the answers were today, and so perhaps you can continue to engage our panelists at the end of our talk at this moment, and right now just join me in giving them a round of applause.
Sorry, me, I didn't even recognize you. Wait. Okay, I wouldn't know your last name. But I know who you are.
I know who you are too.
Wait, Mom.
Mom.
Yeah.
And you're shooting for them?
No, I'm shooting for her. She's my friend. And this is Zelda. This is Pat. Pat, you two film.